Lawyers, what's the worst way to cheat in court you've seen? Story 1. Too many criminal client situations come to mind where they screwed themselves over, but one family law case from my early years as an attorney really stands out. There was a young woman and a young man with a child. The young woman sought a divorce because the young man enjoyed the thug life. He had recently been arrested and charged with possession with intent to distribute a felony and unlawful carry of a firearm. The young man didn't take kindly to her leaving him, so he hired a local big-name divorce attorney. It's worth noting that this was a very rural area. A temporary divorce order was entered, stating she couldn't have overnight guests of the opposite sex, which is common in conservative rural areas. This kind of order is mostly a thing of the past in urban areas. The young woman started seeing someone new, and the young man was furious. He had his fancy lawyer request a hearing, accusing her of violating the court order and seeking full custody on top of attorney fees. On the advice of a mutual friend, the young woman hired me for this hearing. I was a new, inexperienced attorney in town, licensed for less than a year. Opposing counsel tried to strong-arm me with her experience, laying out egregious terms. The mother must not only give up primary custody, but also have supervised visitation and pay child support and attorney fees. I balked and said we'd see her in court. I went into the hearing armed with a copy of his probation arrangement for his possession with intent to sell an unlawful carry charge. Opposing counsel was unaware of this, as her client hadn't told her. She called him to the stand and established that my client had her new boyfriend over on specific nights. The conservative judge was visibly displeased. When opposing counsel passed the witness, I asked him if he had a job. He did not. I asked what he did for money. He replied vaguely, "Things here and there." I pointed out that his attorney was quite expensive and asked if he sold drugs to make ends meet. He denied it. I then introduced a copy of his guilty plea and straight probation sentencing. The judge's gaze turned icy. I leaned over to my client and whispered, "If you took a drug test today, would you be completely clean?" She assured me she would be. I asked the young man when he last did drugs. His attorney objected, but the judge overruled. Knowing the judge often conducted on-the-spot drug tests, I pressed on. The young man claimed it had been years and he was clean. Opposing counsel asked my client the same question, and we agreed to both take the test. The young man tested positive for the drug he had been charged with possessing. My client was clean. The judge denied his motion and instructed me to send in new temporary orders requiring the young man to maintain employment, pay child support, and have supervised visits. The icing on the cake, opposing counsel called me afterward to congratulate me on, and I quote, handing her butt to her. For the first time in a long while. Story 2. This story isn't about my case, but it remains one of the most memorable examples of someone screwing themselves over in court. A 30-year-old defendant was charged with assaulting a minor after his girlfriend's 14-year-old sister got pregnant. The girl decided to keep the baby, and the police waited until the child was born to conduct a paternity test. Unsurprisingly, the test confirmed that the defendant was the father. The defendant wanted probation, but the prosecutor refused to offer it. So, the defendant pled guilty and opted for a jury trial to determine his punishment. In Texas, you can choose to have a jury set the punishment. The evidence presented was pretty straightforward. The victim testified that their relationship was consensual, despite her being too young to legally consent, and the paternity test results were introduced. Then the defendant took the stand. To everyone's shock, his version of events was that he had sneaked into the victim's room at night, covered her mouth, and held her down while he raped her. It seemed his own lawyer was unaware that this was the story he had decided to tell. The jury deliberated for only about 15 minutes before returning with a verdict of 17 years in prison. The maximum sentence he faced was 20 years. When the attorneys interviewed the jurors afterward, one of them explained that they chose 17 years, so the defendant would never forget the age of consent in Texas again. Story 3. This story took place over 4 years ago during a criminal jury trial for misdemeanor criminal mischief. The state had filed charges against my client and kept amending the information so much that they eventually left the actual victim out of the trial, proceeding only with 2 eyewitnesses. The witnesses were my client's ex and the ex's new girlfriend, both of whom claimed my client had vandalized the actual victim's car. My client denied everything. What the state and both witnesses didn't know was that the ex had an outstanding warrant for not paying child support to my client, which provided a strong motive for him to lie. During the trial, I asked the ex if he was aware of the warrant for his arrest while he was on the stand. He had no idea. The judge excused the jurors, and the bailiff promptly arrested the ex right there on the stand. The state rested its case, but we had solid case law on our side, showing that without the victim present, the charges couldn't stand. The judge granted our motion for judgment of acquittal. My client walked away free, while the ex ended up in jail. Story 4. Once, I witnessed an indignant defendant who was in custody tell the judge that his public defender wasn't working hard enough and demanded a different lawyer. The judge asked him to specify what the problem was. He responded, "I need a man who can take charge and fight for me," or something to that effect. The judge, who was also female, responded, "That's not how it works." The defendant started yelling and going into specifics about how he didn't like his public defender because she wouldn't visit him, among other complaints. The judge, clearly annoyed, said, "Fine, I'll appoint another attorney for you, but because you're not satisfied with your attorney and I need to appoint you new counsel, I'm not going to hear any other issues today and will reset your case." A few days later, the judge sent the defendant a notice of his new appointed attorney, who also happened to be female, along with notice of the case being reset for 6 weeks. Originally, the case was set for a bond hearing, and the district attorney and his public defender had agreed to release him on an unsecured bond. This meant he would have gotten out that day if he hadn't thrown his temper tantrum. Instead, he had to wait another 6 weeks in jail just to be represented by another female attorney. Story 5. I've been in an ongoing dispute with British Gas for about 10 years. Every now and again, they take me to court, and each time I win, and we go our separate ways for a few years. The last time, I decided to lawyer up. Although it's a civil matter, it was held in a magistrate's court. My solicitor waited patiently for the British Gas representative to swear his oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Once the guy finished, my solicitor asked him what he knew about the previous court cases. When the British Gas guy admitted he knew nothing about them, my solicitor pounced. He argued that since the representative had just sworn to tell the whole truth, his ignorance of the prior cases rendered his testimony untrustworthy. This went on for a few brutal minutes. The magistrates agreed with my solicitor, and we walked away with £600 in costs. It was incredibly satisfying to see this bloke, who had come in with a threatening attitude, claiming they would force entry into my house with police assistance, be told to sit down and remain silent unless asked a question. For context, this all revolves around a disconnected meter at my house, which is linked to a closed shop. Despite writing to the CEO, involving my MP, and going to court 4 times, British Gas refuses to change or listen. I've given up trying to resolve it outside of court. Now, I just go to court every now and again and claim my £600. Story 6. I'm going to be sparse on details due to confidentiality, but I had a client accused of a very nasty, intimate offense. Fortunately, he had an alibi. He was at work, where he was the boss, and had an employee who could absolutely vouch for his presence there. I spoke to the employee, and he confirmed my client was indeed at work during the time of the alleged offense. As the trial approached, I needed to send in an alibi notice to the Crown so they could investigate the alibi and determine its validity. However, being cautious, I decided to call the employee again to confirm. It turned out that my client had fired this employee in the interim. When I called, the employee candidly told me, "Oh yeah, he was definitely at work, but that's not what I'll say in court. Screw that guy. He's going down." Realizing the potential disaster, I chose not to call this employee as a witness or file the alibi notice. Despite this setback, we still won the trial. If I hadn't thought to double-check with the employee, or if he had been less candid, my client would have been in serious trouble, facing an offender registry, jail time, and the works, despite being completely innocent. It's a strange twist of fate that my client almost screwed himself over by firing the one person who could have provided a solid alibi. And even though the employee wasn't officially involved in the court case, his candid admission could have turned the tide against my client. This story serves as a stark reminder of the unexpected turns that legal battles can take. Story 7. I was sitting in court, waiting for my client, while the judge conducted a mass call for an alternative program for DUI offenders, essentially offering probation. The judge asked, "Has anyone consumed alcohol or taken drugs in the last 24 hours?" The obvious answer was to remain silent or say no. However, one guy proudly raised his hand and declared, "I smoked some dope last night." Needless to say, he did not get probation. Story 8. I'm not a lawyer, but a legal assistant. My attorney is pretty old, so he needs me to help him find papers and stuff in the courtroom. As a result, I end up attending all our domestic and criminal cases. There was this one custody case that really stuck with me. The mom was already in a bad spot because she was literally picked up by a bounty hunter while the dad was there getting their daughter for visitation. Things were not looking good for her from the start. Then, the dad's new wife got on the stand and testified that the mom had threatened to blow their house up. When it was the mom's turn to testify, she got up on the stand and said, "I didn't threaten to blow your house up. I threatened to blow you up." The judge just looked at her in utter disbelief and said, "What?" It was one of those moments where someone is so desperate to be right that they end up prioritizing their need to be right over anything else, even their own best interests. It was an incredible way for her to screw herself over. Her eagerness to set the record straight about the specific nature of her threat just made things worse for her. I feel like this happens a lot in these stories. People get so caught up in the details that they lose sight of the bigger picture. Story 9. I've witnessed some truly infuriating cases in family court, but one particularly stands out. A parent used non-existent discipline as a strategy to win over their teenage child so the child would choose to live with them. This way, the rubbish parent would receive child support from the other parent. It boils my blood to see someone allow their 15-year-old to drop out of school, get high every day, and even buy them drugs and alcohol. They did this purely to avoid paying $100 in child support each month. For those wondering why the child support payments were so low, in my jurisdiction, child support amounts are relative based on the paying parent's situation, income, schooling, assets, etc. These parents were deadbeats, relying on part-time, under-the-table seasonal employment and government welfare. It was appalling to see the extent they would go to avoid their responsibilities. Story 10. I'm not a lawyer, but there was this case in my town between a father and his son that was absolutely hilarious. The dad, George Sink, is a big-time personal injury attorney around here, and he started his own firm under his name. His son ended up joining the family business, which seemed like it was all going smoothly until they had a falling out. After the fallout, the son decided to branch out and start his own firm. The twist? He used his dad's name for his new firm. This kicked off a legal battle where the father was suing the son for using the very name he gave him to start his own law firm. It was a case of the ultimate family name feud. The whole situation struck me as odd. People who name their children after themselves always seemed a bit self-obsessed to me. No judgment, though. I'm sure there are plenty of reasons behind it that I just don't get. Still, watching this father-son dynamic unfold in a courtroom was something else. Story 11. One of my favorite stories, although it wasn't my case, involves a guy who managed to completely screw himself over during his jury trial for a burglary charge. The defendant showed up to court wearing the exact same distinctive sweatshirt he had worn on the night he committed the crime. During the trial, the prosecution presented video evidence from the night of the burglary, clearly showing a man wearing that very sweatshirt. When the jury looked over at the defendant and saw him wearing the same piece of clothing, it was almost impossible to argue that the person in the video wasn't him. Unsurprisingly, the jury convicted him, and he ended up spending a few years in the Department of Corrections. It's a classic case of someone making a really bad decision and paying the price for it. Story 12. I'm not a lawyer, but this story always gets me. My biological grandmother passed away 20 years ago from ovarian cancer. She left all her money, trusts, and bonds to my grandfather to use while he was alive, and to be dispersed after his death. About 15 years ago, my grandfather remarried, and a few years back, he passed away before my step-grandma. Enter my step-aunt, a greedy person who lives on the opposite side of the country. She has lived off her mother and my grandfather all her life, often taking them on vacations where she would use their money to buy herself things and enjoy free skiing trips about 8 times a year. After my grandfather died, my step-grandma had to move closer to her children to receive care for dementia. My step-aunt gained access not only to her own mother's estate, but also to my grandfather's estate to take care of her mother's needs. But this wasn't enough for her. She decided to sue my dad and uncle for their deceased biological mother's estate. My dad is bilaterally paralyzed and in a wheelchair, and my uncle is a triple bypass survivor with a pacemaker and multiple stents. Both are on fixed disability incomes. On the court date, I wheeled my dad in while my uncle walked in with a cane. My step-aunt, on the other hand, is entirely able-bodied and rolling in millions that my step-grandma and grandfather worked their whole lives to earn. The judge took one look at the whole picture and denied my step-aunt access to my biological grandmother's estate. We were in court for less than an hour. I can't fathom what goes on in the mind of someone like my step-aunt. Does she really think she needs the money? It's clearly just greed. I like money too, but I don't need that much. It seems to me that she's trying to reach a high score on a leaderboard of wealth, or accumulate as many possessions as possible. It's beyond me how someone can be so consumed by greed. Story 13. I was involved in a custody case where a wife had cheated on her husband and had a child as a result. She let her husband believe the child was his, until the child was about 5 years old, and they were divorcing. To prevent him from getting custody, she convinced the biological father to seek custody, thinking that if he won, she would end up with the child. This turned into a massive three-way fight involving multiple sets of grandparents. Attorneys' fees skyrocketed because what should have been a relatively quick case turned into a drawn-out legal battle. The wife couldn't afford her attorney and tried to get the biological father to cover the costs, making the situation even messier. To this day, there still isn't an agreement all parties will follow. They find themselves in and out of court every year or so. In trying to manipulate the system, she ended up screwing herself, creating an ongoing nightmare for everyone involved. Story 14. This story isn't about someone else, but rather about a guy and his lawyer who managed to screw themselves over repeatedly. They had a habit of missing court appearances, sometimes one of them, sometimes both, with little or no warning and the most suspect excuses. It got to the point of being ridiculous, and we kept pointing out the holes in their stories. For instance, the guy claimed he left for another country without knowing about the court appearance, yet his lawyer stood in court and said he told him beforehand. Another time, he said he was in a former Soviet bloc country for fertility treatments, and coming back would ruin everything. Then there was the time he was supposedly visiting dying relatives on another continent. Another time, he was supposedly rushing to the hospital instead of the airport and showed us an admitting form in another language. We had it translated, and while it showed he was there, it also showed he had been discharged. He tried firing his attorney, saying he needed more time to brief a new one. Then the new attorney would claim he hadn't been able to talk to his client and needed an adjournment, or the attorney would say he hadn't been paid and his client was basically a jerk, so he needed to be relieved from the case. We kept telling the judge that this guy was stalling, but the judge kept giving him the benefit of the doubt. We even presented other cases where he had skipped appearances, and the judges threatened sanctions. Finally, he didn't show up for an appearance where the judge had specifically said, "I don't care if you're meeting with the Pope. I'm ordering you to be here." Boom. His answer was stricken, and a default judgment was issued in full. Neither he nor his lawyer showed up for the hearing, where the judge determined exactly how much of a judgment we should get. Then, unbelievably, he had the nerve to file a motion claiming the judgment was unfair because he didn't get a chance to dispute anything. Story 15. The worst way I've seen someone screw over another person in court happened during a nasty custody battle. My ex-wife, who was also a lawyer, decided to represent herself. I, on the other hand, had a lawyer who was not exactly the best. She kept dragging me back to court, trying to squeeze more benefits out of me, and my lawyer just allowed it to happen. It was ruining my life. She made allegations of child abuse, and the legal fees were so overwhelming that I could barely afford a dingy apartment and had no money left for a car. These issues eventually played a part in the custody decision. Finally, my ex-wife's father, who was also a lawyer, requested a private meeting with the judge. During this meeting, he revealed several critical details. 1. One of our children had been diagnosed with manic depression, and my ex-wife would intentionally take him off his medication before it was my turn to have custody. This would lead to manic episodes, during which I would have to restrain him because he wasn't medicated. This was the basis for her child abuse allegations against me. 2. She had deliberately timed these allegations to coincide with the holiday season, ensuring I couldn't see the kids for Halloween, Thanksgiving, or Christmas. She even boasted to her family that this would inflict the maximum emotional damage on me. 3. My ex-wife had forged documents to inflate my income when alimony was being determined, making it seem like I could afford much more than I actually could. 4. To top it all off, she was having an affair with my lawyer, It was a devastating experience, watching someone I once trusted use every legal trick in the book to destroy me emotionally and financially. Story 16. This wasn't my case, but I followed it closely because it involved an acquaintance's divorce proceedings. He and his now ex-wife owned some commercial property together, which was quite valuable. They were both listed on the paperwork and had access to the same information about the property. However, things took a turn for the worse, and the property fell into arrears, with a lien eventually filed against it. Throughout this period, the husband tried to discuss the financial issues with his wife, but she consistently blew him off. She ignored him and their financial situation, and to make matters worse, she started cheating on him. Fast forward to their divorce, it was contentious, and they ended up fighting over the primary residence, which unencumbered was worth much less than the commercial property. During the divorce negotiations, she demanded the house. The husband, seeing an opportunity, effectively offered to give her the commercial property if he could keep the residence. She, having never paid attention to the deteriorating condition of the commercial property, agreed. For some baffling reason, her lawyer didn't do any due diligence on the property's current state. They took the deal, and she ended up with the commercial property. I don't know if there were any saving conditions or caveats included in the asset allocation for the ex-wife, but it was satisfying to see that her own disinterest and neglect led her to bargain for an underwater property instead of a fully paid-off house.